Hello, hello. Ken Lane here, API Evangelist, for another one of my API Evangelist conversations where I just sit down with folks who are doing interesting things from across the API space. It's not wasting any time. Who do we have here today? Hello, who are you?
Hi, Ken. Great to see you. I'm Ben Hutton, and I'm a senior software engineer at the Guild, and I'm part of the JSON Schema TSC.
Thanks for joining. We were talking about JSON schema goodness and other things, and it was part of some regular conversations. I was like, "Hey, let's jump over and record this before we dive in too deep." Because you had posted an interesting comment that is, from my perspective, very evergreen and something that comes up in several cycles, and we should talk about again. Can you kind of fill everyone in on what was the post? What did you ask, and what was the response?
Yeah, thanks, Ken. I was chatting with a few different people about their API usage and looking at the API news, and I saw a lot of talk about SDKs. And it got me thinking, what value do people place on SDKs? So I asked the question, or I kind of made a statement and asked what people thought. Developers don't want to use APIs; they want to use SDKs. And I asked people what they thought about that. Deliberately provocative. I wasn't coming down particularly one way or the other. I really wanted to see what people thought, and I was really pleased to see people turn up. A lot of the usual suspects, and a few really great bits of insight as well.
Yeah, it was a nice spread of folks' perspectives coming at it from both sides. And I wanted to, this is a good one. I think that we should maybe talk about from several different directions here, and see if we can't get some other people to kind of chime in and come in. I think there's I know firsthand is a conversation that has a lot of legs and people like to talk about. I would say it's second only to versioning as far as we're coming out of the woodwork with opinions about why you should or shouldn't. And there's several cycles. I would say 3 or 4 where this comes back around and people land on. I mean, one, a lot of people don't see APIs. They see SDKs, they see programming languages, even when they produce them. So you can land on a lot of API portals and people say, "Oh, we have an API," and they have a Python SDK, and that's it. It's like, and it's really just a Python language API. And then, there's the whole try it now kind of interactive Swagger UI evolution of this conversation. There used to be a lot of API explorers. Apogee used to have an API explorer that you could try and play with it. There's that end of it. That morphed into Postman as a client. Like, hey, do I need an SDK? Because I've got a client that's going to actually help me do that. And you and I both worked at Postman. And then I remember like run scope era. So this was 2015, 16. So John Sheehan left Twilio and started run scope, a monitoring solution. And he was very anti SDK. So he started a wave of people saying, you don't need SDKs. You just need a spec. You need the open API or other, and you just ingest it and you're better off without it. And I remember this was right when Adil from Appomatic first showed up on the scene with his SDK generator, and they were really mean to him, I remember. And then I've seen it flip both directions, like kind of, there's different camps kind of reflecting your perspective. So my question for you is, where do you land with if you're working with an API? Where do you start, and then how would you move it into production?
Yeah, thanks. Kind of like I think I was really torn. I wasn't 100% sure, and I still think you have to play the "it depends" card. I mean, it really does depend what you're working with. I've consumed many APIs from different providers, but I found I've rarely used an SDK, and rarely use those in production. I think that's partly due to the languages I've worked in, mostly not being strongly typed. I think, when you work in strongly typed languages like .NET, then you want to avoid having to write a lot of boilerplate code, or you want to to avoid writing all the stuff that you just really don't want to. Um, I think ultimately SDKs are not necessarily, about providing easy interfaces as much as it's about saving time. I think it's whatever's gonna enable the developer to reach whatever they need from the API as fast as possible. Now, when it's like fairly simple APIs, or if it's just a few APIs, or if you only need to access like a very small section of the API that's available, then using direct HTTP calls might be the right approach, using some sort of wrapper. And, you might write some sort of auth wrapper around that as well, just to mitigate having to manage that, or having a proper separation of concern with that. But when I started playing about with the GitHub API, and I started needing to make more and more calls to different places, and needing to do more and more nice pagination stuff, I started looking at the SDK a lot more, and found it a really nice experience. And for those sorts of APIs, it's certainly a win for developer productivity, and it's going to make me use it more.
Well, you position, you know, yourself as a consumer of an API, GitHub, but you really spoke to like its core purpose is to like reduce friction, make it easier to onboard with an API. But before we started recording, you were talking about like visibility and observability and analytics and being at like from a producer's perspective. I mean, first and foremost, you want to make it easier for people to onboard, but there's other reasons that you might want to use an SDK that you had mentioned from the conversation thread. Can you talk about those?
Yeah, I think certainly, as you say, like it can make onboarding easier. People don't have to learn like a new type of authentication. They don't have to write their own wrapper. They can just use what's provided, and it's simpler for onboarding. In terms of like the other reasons, I think often, as a publisher of APIs, you want to have, as you say, like good observability on your API. And if you're receiving individual HTTP calls, yeah, you can make assumptions about the process or the flow that people are doing. But if it's all coming from the same machine, you might not have good visibility on like a thread or a workflow of a particular action. Um, Maybe it's not quite the best explanation, but like when you're thinking about um, when a user interacts with a service, and that creates 5 API calls as a result to get certain sets of information. As the API producer, you can't tell that those 5 API calls are associated with a user of the system that's making that call. But if you have an SDK and you provide the SDK, then you can do that sort of analytics. You can actually have session or workflow attributes in your API calls, or you could modify how your API calls work without interrupting the consumer of those APIs. I mean, that was one of the really interesting threads in the LinkedIn discussion. Was actually it enables you to give your API consumers a level of abstraction that means you can make changes that would otherwise be breaking changes, and you wouldn't want that. I mean, that's probably like a really nice feature for many companies that can't do the same level of API production as Stripe, for example, where they support n number of versions of their API concurrently and translate between them, which is still pretty impressive. Companies don't do that, so they need to have another way to push out the updated versions or updated routes of their API without impacting their consumers.
Yeah, really. I mean, more awareness from a producer standpoint of what your consumers need or are doing and how they're using your SDK, your API. But managing change of, with those users and being able to, and there was another wave of hypermedia conversations around people, that's why you want to do hypermedia, because you have the SDK, and you
Sure.
can, make it easier to not introduce breaking changes and kind of keep people stable, and use things. But there's also like the low code, no code. Like, I don't, how do you see the difference between snippets, libraries, SDKs? Like, and you mentioned the auth layer there, like the abstraction of the auth layer, and you just mentioned abstraction of analytics and breaking changes. Like, what's the difference between those layers, would you say?
Yeah, wow. I think when you start thinking about like the low code adaptations, like I haven't used low code extensively, but I certainly got into the nitty gritty and had to, add some code on top of that, on a number of different interactions and a number of different services. And I found it doesn't often break. Um, from doing like a case study was, for example, some of the approaches they take, and they shift a lot of the responsibility of in terms of what it does and how the update process works between published versions of the connectors onto the producer of that API. So they make it easier for themselves in a lot of ways, and they have to define their interfaces and code. Um, but I think, yeah, I guess it's like an SDK is a similar level of abstraction to a low code client for developers more, because you still got to write the code to use the SDK, right? But I guess it's kind of that level of you need to get more work done faster, and calling the APIs directly probably isn't going to cut it. Or you know how to use a particular approach. Um, I think when you start thinking about the hypermedia HTTP APIs, um, there aren't many I've seen that really work. The standards out there for doing them are not finished. You can kind of put them in production, and there's a few um, you know client libraries you can use, and it does work. And even the server um, libraries to assist in that do work. But there are caveats, and there are things that you can't easily work around, having put some of those things into production. And ultimately, when you're faced with a choice of, do I want this thing that I don't have complete control of, or do I want to have control over it? Yeah, like if I'm a company and I'm publishing an API, and I can exert a level of control, or a level of story or benefit or perception onto your API consumers through the use of an SDK, that certainly sounds like something that'd be beneficial.
Would you say, I mean, there's situations where that's beneficial, but I saw on the thread there's people who are like, I don't want, it's harder for me to get your code into my enterprise
Mm.
system. I don't trust you. And is it hard both ways? Is it a double-edged sword?
Yeah, and I think this was a lot of the discussion. Like it's not an either or situation, and it really, and you know, the preference should be for both, and we'll come back to that, I think, for a bit more later. But the threads I picked up on the more sort of like regulated industries, like particularly finance, health, where getting changes into production are costly. Like a lot of companies and a lot of people boast about their rapid deployment process. Oh, we deploy like 30 times a day or whatever. Like, yeah, if you're an unregulated industry and you're a startup, and you have a small team, or even if you have a large team and you have your CI/CD set up well and you have lovely tests, like you can deploy 50 times a day. Great. But for a regulated industry that requires a manual review and different levels of review, like finance, yeah, you're not going to be able to do that. You want to make a change, you want to pull in an SDK, that's suddenly a huge risk, and that review period is going to be much larger. Whereas if you're just making API calls and you've written your own thin wrapper around that, that's a lot easier to get through that change process. And that's before you even start talking about the additional dependencies you bring along with an SDK.
Mhm.
I mean, I'm sure there are SDKs out there which don't have any dependencies, but I'm pretty confident that many of them have a lot of dependencies, particularly in the Node.js ecosystem.
Mhm. Yes. Well, and then you touch on from a producer standpoint, supporting SDKs in multiple languages and understanding the nuance of those languages and the ecosystems around those languages, as you just mentioned. So yeah, there's a lot more added cost when it comes to that. And then what would you say, like, how do you prioritize if you're going to be doing? I mean, I guess you got to know your consumers and what language they work in, right? And that's where you start.
I mean, yeah, there's a couple of approaches to this, and like as I mentioned earlier, I don't think it's either or. And I think most people would agree that it's not an either or, and it has to be, API first, and it has to be a good API. I mean, what do we mean by good API is like a whole other discussion. But if you get your foundations right, you define your API well, you make sure it matches up to your API in production based on your API definitions. Generating your client code suddenly becomes a lot easier. I think there's a sweet spot between fully generated API SDKs and customized handwritten SDKs. There's a sweet spot between that where you generate a lot of it and you have the ability to like add and extend and customize that approach. Ultimately, a lot of the stuff in the SDK is going to be like boilerplate stuff and not particularly exciting. You might have some auth stuff in there. Okay, right, you should be using existing libraries to do that well. Unless you have some like really weird auth thing, in which case people aren't going to really like you doing that. Um, but I think there's a sweet spot there to be had, and everybody publishing an API who wants to have an SDK, if they have those good foundations, they'll be able to try and move that dial and see where that sweet spot is for them. Like there's certainly a cost involved. It's whether that cost material comes to provide the business value of the game. Like seeing a few reports from different places that having an SDK dramatically increases the onboarding of their API usage. And where your API is your product, or a big portion of your product for certain tech companies, like if you can move that metric by generating an SDK, suddenly that becomes a lot more interesting and worthwhile spending time investigating.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's a lot more to unpack on the business, making sense of the business. But one last question before we end this is just anecdotally, what's your gut from that thread on LinkedIn? Are we entering in a pro SDK phase or are we entering into an anti SDK phase?
Wow. I think maybe I'm somewhat shielded from seeing the SDKs working in a non-typed language. And I think people have wanted them. But I think we are going to see over the next few years definitely a positive shift towards more SDK usage. Things are complicated, but also tooling wants to be able to use them in a way that's not going to affect them when there are changes. You want to insulate consumers from the producers, and allow the producers to do what they need, allow the consumers to do what they need. And that insulation layer, I think, is going to become really valuable in a space which is fast evolving and dynamic. And thinking more broadly, I just want to bring up like one of the quotes on one of the comments I had from our friend Lorna Mitchell. She said we find it easier to build technical solutions than to think about how to solve a hard problem. And I think it's really poignant. Like we can build amazing SDKs from API descriptions, but unless our APIs themselves are good for a measure of good, those SDKs are going to be garbage. And I think although we're going to move in a pro SDK direction, um, the result of that is going to be we need more tooling and we need more support and we need more enablement and education of those underlying foundational things which enable that good SDK generation and have a metric by which we can analyze those.
Ooh.
And that's going to be, really telling when we come to evaluate whether a company has released a good SDK or not. Like, okay, let's go back and measure the foundations that you use to build that SDK and see if our measures are correctly predicting the quality and utility of your SDK.
Ooh. Ooh, I like that. I think you're gonna have to come back and we're gonna have to do an episode just to explore that. So my prediction is yes, we're entering into a pro SDK phase. But I'll echo exactly what you said is we're going to be using it to abstract away all the wrong thing. We're going to abstract away complexity, lack of design, uh, copyright infringement in support of AI. We're going to be abstracting away all the wrong things, and we're not going to properly invest in auth or analytics or understanding. Um, and it's also that this wave of SDK will be very vendor driven, which doesn't always bode well for meaningful outcomes. So just to be a little darker there, but echoing what you said. But I want to have you'll definitely come back and we'll talk more about I think the rating, the quality metric and
Mm,
camera visibility. So
yeah. I mean, not all SDKs are created equal. And I think that's going to become more apparent where we see them being generated for the most
well,
part.
and not all generators are created equal.
Yeah.
Not all specs feeding the gens. So yes, we got more to talk about. Thanks for coming by, Ben.
Thank you so much, Ken.
Bye. Yeah, SDK. It's an important one, and I can see it on the horizon. I see it. I've got 5 or 6 new vendors approaching me to sponsor API evangelists that are SDKs, and not my girlfriend old school versions of those at Appomatic and others who've been doing it for a long time and know the challenges. So lots to discuss. Anyways, thanks everyone for showing up. Bye.